A mountain man was still a virgin at 40, and he figured he'd die that way. He thought his lonely cabin, perched high in the country where the eagles nested, would stay silent forever. But one winter night, as the storm howled like a pack of starving wolves, 12 desperate women appeared at his door. They were Amish, their faces pale under their bonnets, and they were begging for warmth, for food, for protection. His name was Mark Boone, and for 20 years the only thing he'd touch with any tenderness was the stock of his rifle. At first he was too ashamed, too broken by a world that had spit him out long ago. He was a giant of a man, scarred and unused to the sound of a human voice that wasn't his own. But as the fire burned low that first night, their hymns filled his tiny cabin, and for the first time in a lifetime, his heart felt something other than the steady, lonely beat of survival. Then came the whispers in town. They rode on the cold wind down from his mountain and slithered through the saloon doors. Men with greedy eyes started looking up the trail. A sheriff with iron keys in his pocket and a colder iron heart started asking questions. And a railroad agent, a man with a smile like a razor and a hunger for land, arrived on the morning train, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Because these 12 women weren't just homeless travelers. Oh no, they carried secrets. They carried a fortune in land. And they carried a hope that was worth fighting for and worth dying for. Now the mountain man, the ghost of the high country, had to make a choice. Would he stay hidden in the shadows of his shame? Or would he rise up and become the protector they already believed he was? Was he strong enough to face the guns, the fire, and the lies that were coming for them? Or would his own fear be the thing that condemned them all? The wind howled against the cabin walls as Mark Boone held his rough-hewn door open. Snow, sharp as glass shards, swirled past him into the warmth of his home. One by one, 12 Amish women hurried inside, their dark woolen dresses and crisp white bonnets dusted with crystalline frost. Their boots made soft, heavy thuds on his plank floor, and the air, once smelling only of pine smoke and old leather, now filled with the scent of wet wool and cold fear. Mark's hands that could split an oak log with one swing, trembled as he barred the door against the storm. He'd never had a single visitor, not one, let alone a dozen women. His throat felt like it was packed with sand as he turned to face them, ducking his head to avoid their eyes. A habit he'd had since he was a boy who'd grown too big, too fast. The cabin, which had always felt spacious enough for one man and his ghosts, now seemed impossibly small, the walls closing in. A woman stepped forward. She was older than some, younger than others, with a quiet strength in her face that seemed to anchor the entire group. "We thank thee for thy Christian charity," she said. Her voice was steady, but her face was etched with a weariness that went bone deep. "God has surely guided our path to thy door." Mark just nodded. The words stuck somewhere in his chest. The other women huddled together near his pot-bellied stove, their faces pale and drawn with cold. Some were barely more than girls, their eyes wide with shock. Others had the lined faces of women who had known hardship, who had buried husbands and sons. All of them looked like they were at the very end of their rope. "I reckon you'll want to warm yourselves," he finally managed to say, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth. He moved to add more wood to the stove, the familiar task a small comfort that helped steady his hands. "Got some rabbit stew cooking. Not much, but you're welcome to share." "That is very kind," the woman said. Her name was Amanda Fisher. She turned to the others, her tone gentle but firm, a general rallying her exhausted troops. "Sisters, let us remove our wet things and help our host. We must not be a burden." Mark watched in stunned silence. He had expected chaos, tears, maybe panic. Instead, these women organized themselves with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. Wet bonnets and shawls were carefully hung from the rafters to dry. Some of them moved to his small cooking area and began to supplement his meager stew with dried vegetables they produced from small satchels. Others arranged their bedrolls in neat, orderly rows along the walls. Their movements were graceful, purposeful. They were a unit. "Mr. Boone," Amanda said, approaching him where he stood awkwardly by the stove, feeling like a bear in his own den. "I hope we do not impose, But might we bring in some supplies from our wagon? We have flour and dried goods. He nodded quickly, grateful for a task, for a reason to escape the sudden, intense domesticity of his home. I'll fetch them. You ladies stay warm. The thought of them struggling back out into that blizzard was unthinkable. Outside, the storm had become a living thing, a white monster that clawed at the world. Mark pushed through waist-deep drifts, his powerful legs driving him toward their wagon, a dark shape barely visible through the swirling snow. The horses had already been unhitched and led to his small barn, a small act of foresight that surprised him. These women forgot nothing. Inside the wagon, he found carefully packed barrels and boxes, everything lashed down and protected from the weather. He carried them to the cabin in several trips, his frame, built for hauling timber and game, making light work of the heavy loads. When he returned with the last barrel, the cabin had been transformed. It was no longer just his shelter, it was a home. A pot of tea steamed on the stove alongside his stew, which now smelled richer and heartier than anything he'd ever cooked. Two of the younger women were kneading bread dough on his rough-hewn table. Others were mending tears in their traveling clothes by the flickering lamplight, their needles moving with swift, sure strokes. It was a hive of quiet, determined activity. "We hope thee does not mind," Amanda said, noticing the stunned look on his face. "We thought to make ourselves useful." Mark just shook his head, amazed at how they had brought so much life into this sparse, lonely place. "No, ma'am, don't mind at all." He set down the last barrel and retreated to his usual corner, suddenly unsure of his place in this new version of his own home. He felt like an intruder. The women worked together seamlessly, their voices a low, soft murmur, occasionally speaking in the melodic tones of Pennsylvania German. Mark watched them from his corner, feeling like a boulder in the middle of a gentle stream. His size had always made him feel awkward, clumsy, a thing of brute force in a world that valued grace. Now, surrounded by these delicate but resilient women, he felt it more than ever, trying to make himself smaller, to take up less space. Amanda seemed to sense his discomfort. She approached him again, her manner direct but gentle. "Mr. Boone, we understand this must be unusual for thee. We do not wish to disturb thy peace." He met her eyes for a brief second before looking away at the floorboards. "It's no trouble, ma'am. Just not used to company is all. Call me Amanda, please." She offered a small, tired smile, and something in his chest, something old and frozen, seemed to tighten. "We fled difficult circumstances in the East. We seek only peace and a place to practice our faith freely." Mark nodded. He understood more than she could ever guess about seeking peace away from the judging eyes of others. The isolation of this mountain had been his shield, his fortress against a world that had never known what to do with him. But something about Amanda's quiet strength, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes when she looked at the younger women, made him want to help. It made him want to be worthy of the incredible trust they had placed in him, a complete stranger. As evening deepened, the cabin filled with the impossible aromas of fresh-baked bread and simmering stew. The women arranged themselves around his table and on his few chairs, some sitting on their bedrolls on the floor. Amanda led them in a quiet prayer of thanksgiving, their heads bowed, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the lamp. Mark stood awkwardly to the side, feeling the familiar prickle of shame, until Amanda gestured to an empty space on the bench beside her. "Please join us, Mr. Boone. We would be honored to share this meal with our host." He settled himself carefully onto the bench, conscious of how it creaked and groaned under his weight. One of the younger girls, with eyes the color of a summer sky, served him a steaming bowl of the enhanced stew and a thick slice of warm bread. The simple food he'd eaten 1,000 times alone, seemed completely different now. It was transformed, seasoned by the simple presence of others to share it with. As they ate, the women spoke quietly among themselves. They included him in their conversation with gentle questions about the mountain, the weather, his knowledge of the land. He found himself answering, his responses growing less hesitant, less gruff, as the meal progressed. He learned they had been traveling for weeks, seeking a place far from the troubles that had driven them from their home in Pennsylvania. Amanda spoke of their hope, their dream, of finding a parcel of land where they could build a new community, one true to their beliefs but free from the persecution they had faced. But there was something she wasn't saying. He could see it in the way her eyes would occasionally dart toward the door, in the way her hands would clench in her lap when she thought no one was watching. They weren't just running from persecution. They were running from something specific, something that was chasing them. Mark found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. Her face held a deep wisdom, a profound sense of care for her flock, but it was shadowed by a deep, powerful exhaustion she tried desperately to hide. He recognized the weight of that kind of responsibility, the burden of carrying the needs and fears of others alongside your own. After the meal, the women insisted on cleaning up, despite his protests. They worked with that same quiet efficiency, making his few dishes and pots shine in a way they never had before. As they prepared for sleep, Amanda approached him one final time. "We thank thee again for thy kindness," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the now quiet cabin. "We have prayed for guidance on our journey, and finding thy cabin in this storm. It feels like an answer to those prayers." Mark shifted uncomfortably at the mention of prayer. His own faith had grown thin and ragged during his long years of solitude, though he still read his mother's old Bible by lamplight on the loneliest nights. "Storm's likely to last a few days," he said, avoiding her gaze, focusing on the practical. "You're welcome to stay until it's safe to travel." Amanda's eyes seemed to understand everything he left unsaid. "We are grateful, and perhaps—" She hesitated, then continued with a gentle directness that was both unnerving and compelling. "Perhaps God has brought us here for thy sake as well as ours." Before Mark could even begin to process that unsettling thought, she had turned away to help arrange the sleeping area. He watched as the women settled onto their bedrolls, their movements slow with exhaustion. Amanda checked on each one, a soft word of encouragement here, a comforting touch on the shoulder there, before finding her own place to rest near the hearth. Mark climbed the ladder to his small sleeping loft, leaving the main room to his guests. As he lay down on his simple straw mattress, listening to the storm rage outside and the soft, rhythmic sounds of breathing from below, he felt the thick, stone walls he'd built around his life beginning to crack. The simple, profound presence of these women, their quiet strength and unshakable faith, was stirring something long dormant within his heart. He thought of Amanda's words about God's purpose. For the first time in more than a decade, he found himself forming a genuine prayer, a simple, desperate plea for guidance in this impossible situation. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, his dreams were filled not with the usual ghosts of his past, but with the sound of gentle voices and the smell of fresh bread in his once empty, once lonely cabin. The storm continued to howl, a relentless assault on his small fortress. But inside the cabin, a different kind of warmth had taken hold, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Mark Boone's solitary world had been shattered in the space of a single evening. And though he couldn't yet see where this new path might lead, he felt a strange, terrifying mix of dread and hope at the possibility of something new. He drifted into an uneasy sleep, but was jolted awake hours later by a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the gentle breathing of the sleeping women. It was a soft, scraping sound from outside, near the wagon. He rose silently, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor of the loft. He crept to the small window that overlooked the clearing. The storm had lessened slightly, and the moon, a pale, watery disk, broke through the clouds for a moment. And in that fleeting moonlight, he saw them. Two figures, bundled against the cold, were moving around the women's wagon. They weren't just seeking shelter. They were searching it, ripping open canvas coverings, tossing aside boxes. They were looking for something, something specific. Mark's blood ran cold. The danger wasn't days away in a town full of greedy men. It was here, now. And it had followed these women through the heart of a killer storm. The world he had hidden from for 20 years had just kicked down his door. He grabbed the heavy axe that leaned against the wall, its familiar weight a grim comfort in his hand. He moved down the ladder as silently as a shadow, his mind racing. Who were they? What were they looking for? And how in God's name had they tracked this wagon to his isolated doorstep? He slipped out the back door, the one he used for hunting, melting into the deep shadows at the edge of the tree line. The wind whipped at him, but he didn't feel the cold. All he felt was a cold, hard rage building in his chest. A protective instinct he thought had died long ago roared back to life. His cabin, his sanctuary had been invaded, and these women, these strangers who had brought light back into his life, were threatened. He moved through the snow with the practiced silence of a predator, circling around the clearing to get a better view. The two men were growing frustrated. One of them kicked the side of the wagon, the sound a dull thud in the night. "It ain't here, Jed," one of them growled, his voice a low rasp carried on the wind. "She must have it on her." "The satchel," the other one, Jed, replied. "It's gotta be in that leather satchel she never puts down. We'll have to go inside." Go inside. The words echoed in Mark's mind. They were going to enter his cabin, his home, where 12 women lay sleeping, defenseless. Not on his watch. Mark stepped out from the shadows of the trees. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The sheer sight of him was enough. A mountain of a man, stripped to the waist despite the freezing cold. His face a mask of fury, a woodsman's axe held loosely in one hand. He was the embodiment of the mountain's wrath. The two men froze, their eyes wide with shock and fear. They had expected a simple farmer, maybe an old prospector. Not this. Not this elemental force of nature that stood before them. "You're on the wrong mountain." Mark's voice was a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together. "And you've got about 10 seconds to get off it before I plant this axe in your spine." For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the howling of the wind. Then, Jed's hand slowly went for the pistol tucked into his belt. It was a fatal mistake. Mark didn't hesitate. He didn't charge. He simply threw the axe. It cartwheeled through the air, a spinning blade of death in the moonlight, and embedded itself with a sickening thud deep into the heavy wooden post of the barn, just inches from Jed's head. The force of the impact made the entire structure shudder. Jed and his partner stared at the quivering axe handle, then back at the giant, unarmed man who stood before them, and they understood. This wasn't a threat. It was a promise. They turned and fled, stumbling and falling through the deep snow, disappearing into the darkness of the storm like the phantoms they were. Mark strode forward and pulled his axe from the post, the wood groaning in protest. He stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, the cold air burning his lungs. The immediate danger was gone, but the questions remained, sharper and more urgent than ever. A leather satchel. They were after a satchel. He turned and looked back at the cabin, where a single lamp had just been lit in the window. A silhouette stood there, watching. It was Amanda. She had seen it all. He walked back to the cabin, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving behind a cold certainty. The storm outside was nothing. The real storm, the one that had followed these women all the way from Pennsylvania, was just beginning, and his cabin, his quiet sanctuary, was now the dead center of it. When he stepped back inside, the women were all awake, huddled together, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Amanda stood apart, her composure unshaken, but her eyes held a new depth of concern. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather satchel. She held it against her chest like a shield. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the tense silence. "I believe there is something these should know." She placed the satchel on the table and unbuckled the straps. She didn't pull out money or jewels. She pulled out a single folded document, yellowed with age but with an official seal still clearly visible at the bottom. She smoothed it out on the rough wooden surface. It was a land deed, a legal title to 500 acres of prime timber in Riverland, not 10 miles from where they now stood. It was signed and validated by a federal judge back east, and the name of the owner listed on the deed was not Amanda Fisher. It was the name of her late husband and the husbands of the other 11 women in the room. "This land was purchased legally by our husbands before the accident," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "It was to be our new home, a new beginning for our community. The railroad company offered to buy it. We refused. They did not take our refusal well." Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The men at the wagon, the whispers in town, the railroad agent. This wasn't about persecution. This wasn't about 12 helpless women. This was about money. It was about land. And it was about a powerful corporation that would stop at nothing to get what it wanted. They didn't see women who had lost everything. They saw an obstacle. They believe that without our menfolk, we are weak, Amanda continued, her eyes flashing with a fire Mark had not seen before. They believe they can frighten us, cheat us, or simply take what is rightfully ours. They sent those men to steal the deed, thinking without it, we would have no claim. Mark looked from the deed on the table to the faces of the women around the room. He saw the fear, yes, but underneath it, he saw something else, a steely resolve, a quiet defiance. These were not helpless doves. They were lionesses defending their last patch of ground, and they had chosen his mountain to make their stand. They'll be back, Mark said, his voice flat, and they won't send just 2 men next time. He looked at Amanda, a silent question passing between them. She didn't flinch. She simply folded the deed, placed it back in the satchel, and buckled the straps. We know, she said. That is why God led us to you, Mr. Boone. We cannot fight them with guns and fists, but we have faith, and we believe you were placed here for a reason. Mark looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of solitary labor and a past he tried to bury. He had come to this mountain to escape the world of men and their endless, brutal conflicts. He had sought peace in silence and solitude, but the world had followed him. It had brought its greed and its violence right to his doorstep. He could tell them to leave. He could send them on their way at first light, deed and all. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. He could go back to his quiet life, his silent cabin, his lonely existence. But as he looked at Amanda's face, at the unwavering trust in her eyes, he knew he couldn't. He was already in too deep. Her fight was now his fight. My name is Mark, he said, the words feeling strange. He hadn't asked anyone to call him by his first name in 20 years. Just Mark. A small, genuine smile touched Amanda's lips. Mark, she repeated, then we shall face what is coming, together. The fire popped and hissed in the stove. Outside, the wind howled its mournful song. The siege had begun, and Mark Boone, the hermit of the high country, had just chosen his side. He didn't know it yet, but this decision would unearth ghosts from his own past, secrets buried deeper than any winter snow. The men from the railroad were not the only ones with a history. Mark Boone had one too, and it was about to come roaring back to life. The next morning dawned crisp and unnaturally clear. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine, silent white. But the beauty of it was lost on Mark. The peace of his mountain had been shattered, replaced by a tense, watchful energy. Every snap of a frozen branch, every call of a distant bird sounded like a threat. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a strange mix of grim determination and focused industry. The women did not sit and wait for disaster. They worked. Under Amanda's quiet direction, they began to turn the cabin into a defensible fortress. Windows were checked, doors were reinforced with furniture. They boiled water, prepared food, and sharpened any tool that could be used as a weapon. Mark watched them, a growing sense of awe mixing with his dread. They were not warriors, but they had the resilience of survivors. They moved with a shared purpose, a silent understanding passing between them. He realized he wasn't just protecting 12 individuals. He was protecting a living, breathing community. He took it upon himself to scout the perimeter. With his long rifle in hand, he moved through the deep snow, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of movement, any track that didn't belong. The air was still and cold, his breath pluming in front of him. He circled his clearing, his path taking him wider and wider into the surrounding woods. It was on the ridge overlooking the trail that led down to town that he found it. Tracks. A dozen or more horses, all shod, meaning they were from town. They had come up the trail during the night, stopping just out of sight of his cabin. They had waited, and then they had retreated. They were planning something. A direct assault on a remote cabin was risky. They would try something else first, something smarter. He hurried back to the cabin, his mind racing. He burst through the door, the cold air swirling in with him. They're planning something, he said, his voice urgent. They scouted the place. They know what they're up against now. They'll be back, and they'll be official. Amanda looked up from where she was rationing out their remaining flour. Official? The sheriff, Mark said, his jaw tight. Sheriff Clay Dobbs. He's not a good man. He works for whoever has the deepest pockets. And right now, that's the railroad. As if on cue, a sound reached them from the valley below. A single, clear note from a bugle. It wasn't a military call, it was a signal. Mark's blood ran cold. He knew that signal. He hadn't heard it in over 20 years, but you never forget a sound like that. It was the sound of a manhunt. He went to the window and looked down the long, winding path. And there they were. A posse of riders, maybe 10 of them, moving slowly and deliberately up the mountain. At their head was Sheriff Dobbs, his silver badge glinting in the morning sun. But it wasn't Dobbs that made Mark's heart hammer against his ribs. It was the man riding beside him. He was a tall, thin man in an expensive city coat and a bowler hat. He looked completely out of place in the rugged wilderness, but he rode his horse with an easy confidence. His name was Silas Kane, and he was the chief agent for the Titan Pacific Railroad. Mark had seen his picture in the newspapers down in Denver. Kane was known for getting what he wanted. He was part lawyer, part viper, and all predator, and he had brought the law with him. Stay inside, Mark commanded the women, his voice a low growl. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone, not even me. Not unless I give the signal. What is the signal? One of the younger girls asked, her voice trembling. Mark paused, his hand on the door latch. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on each of their faces. He was making a promise. I'll knock 3 times, he said, like a heartbeat. He stepped outside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The solid thud of the bar falling into place echoed from within. He stood on his porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, and waited. He was alone, one man against a posse. But this was his mountain. He knew every tree, every rock, every shadow, and he would not let them pass. The posse came to a halt at the edge of the clearing. Sheriff Dobbs and Silas Kane dismounted, their boots crunching in the snow as they approached the cabin. The other men stayed on their horses, their hands resting on their pistols, their faces hard and grim. They formed a semicircle, cutting off any chance of escape. Mark Boone, the sheriff called out, his voice oily and false. We don't want any trouble here. We just have some questions for the ladies you're harboring. They're not harboring, Mark's voice was steady, calm, but it carried across the clearing with an unnerving intensity. They're my guests. Silas Kane stepped forward, a thin smile playing on his lips. He looked Mark up and down, his eyes taking in the man's immense size and rugged appearance. Mr. Boone, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, I am Silas Kane, an agent of the Titan Pacific Railroad. We believe these women are in possession of a document that was obtained through fraudulent means, a land deed. We simply wish to correct this clerical error. There's no error, Mark said. I've seen the deed. It's legal, signed and sealed. Kane's smile tightened. Legal documents can be complicated. Sometimes grieving widows can be taken advantage of by unscrupulous parties. We are merely here to protect their interests. They seem to think their interests are best protected right where they are, Mark replied, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. Sheriff Dobbs stepped forward, resting his hand on the butt of his holstered Colt. Now see here, Boone. You're obstructing a legal inquiry. These women are material witnesses. I have a warrant here that says I can take them into custody for their own protection. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a joke, and everyone knew it. A warrant cooked up over whiskey at the saloon. But it had the sheriff's signature on it, and in this county that was enough. You're not taking anyone, Mark said. The words hung in the cold air, a clear and simple challenge. Silas Kane sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. We were hoping to resolve this peacefully, Mr. Boone, but it seems you are determined to be unreasonable. You see, that land is vital for the expansion of the railroad, for progress, for the future of this great nation. A handful of squatters cannot be allowed to stand in the way of that. They're not squatters, Mark said, his voice dropping even lower. They're landowners, and this is my land, and I'm telling you, and the sheriff, and all your hired guns, to get off it. The tension in the clearing stretched taut. thin and brittle like a sheet of ice. The men on horseback shifted, their hands tightening on their weapons. Sheriff Dobbs' face was turning a blotchy red with anger. But Silas Kane just smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile. He had expected this. He had planned for it. "I think you misunderstand your position, Mr. Boone," Kane said softly. He reached into his own coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. He flipped it open. "I've had my people do some research on you. It's amazing what one can find in old military records and Pinkerton files. For a man who wants to be left alone, you've left quite a trail." Mark felt a jolt, as if he'd been struck by lightning. His past, the one thing he had run from, the thing he had buried under 20 years of silence. "You see," Kane continued, his voice dripping with venom, "we know you're not Mark Boone. That's a name you invented. Your real name is Marcus Kane, formerly a sergeant with the Union Army, dishonorably discharged for extreme violence. After that, a short but very eventful career as an enforcer for the mining companies in Colorado, wanted for questioning in the disappearance of 3 Union organizers. A man with a reputation for being very, very good at making problems disappear." A ripple of unease went through the posse. The local men knew Mark as a quiet, reclusive mountain man. They didn't know this other person, this Marcus Kane. The sheriff's eyes widened. He had known Boone was tough, but he hadn't known this. Kane closed his book with a soft snap. "So you see, Marcus, you are in no position to be lecturing anyone about the law. In fact, one word from me, and the U.S. Marshals would be very interested to come up this mountain and have a long talk with you. Now I'll ask you one last time. Step aside. Let the sheriff do his duty. Let us talk to the women, and we can all forget we ever had this conversation, and we can forget your real name." It was a brilliant move. Kane hadn't just brought guns and a fake warrant. He had brought Mark's own history as a weapon. He was trying to poison him in the eyes of the very people he was trying to protect. Mark stood frozen on the porch, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. He could feel the eyes of the women on him through the cracks in the cabin walls. Were they hearing this? Did they now believe he was nothing more than a violent killer, a fraud? Had he brought his own dark past crashing down on their heads? The choice was simple. He could give in, let them take the women, and his secret would be safe. He could slink back into the shadows and disappear again. Or he could stand his ground. He could fight for them, and in doing so, he would have to face the man he used to be. The man he had spent half his life trying to outrun. Silas Kane's smile widened. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken the mountain man, but he didn't know one thing. Marcus Kane wasn't just a violent man. He was a survivor, and he was done running. Mark slowly raised his rifle, the movement fluid and deliberate. He didn't point it at Kane. He pointed it at a small dead branch on a pine tree 100 yards away. Without seeming to aim, he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot echoed through the valley, and the branch exploded into splinters. The horses shied, and the men in the posse flinched. Mark lowered the rifle, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. He looked directly at Silas Kane, his eyes as cold and hard as the winter ground. "My name," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, "is Mark Boone, and this is my mountain. Your move." The silence that followed was absolute. Kane's smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, then fury. He had played his trump card, and it had failed. He had tried to break Mark with his past, but he had only succeeded in reminding him of who he truly was, a fighter. Sheriff Dobbs, however, saw his opening. With Mark's violent history now public knowledge, he had the perfect excuse. "He's a wanted man," Dobbs yelled, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and righteous anger. "A dangerous fugitive. We're taking him in, boys, dead or alive." But the men in the posse were no longer so eager. They were local ranchers and farmhands, pressed into service by the sheriff. They had signed up to intimidate some women, not to get into a shooting war with a legendary Army sergeant on his home turf. They looked at the splintered branch, at the cold certainty in Mark's eyes, and they hesitated. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension. The heavy bar on the cabin door was being lifted. The door creaked open, and Amanda Fisher stepped out onto the porch, followed by the 11 other women. They stood behind Mark, a silent, defiant line. They had heard everything. Amanda's eyes were fixed on Silas Kane, and they held no fear, only a cold, burning contempt. "We will not be intimidated by you, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice ringing with clarity and strength. "And we will not be turned against the man who has offered us sanctuary. Whatever Mr. Boone's past may be, he has shown us more Christian charity than we have seen from any of you so-called men of the law." She then turned her gaze to the men of the posse. "Go home to your wives and your daughters," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its power. "Is this why you wear a badge, Sheriff? To terrorize widows? Is this what the railroad's money has bought? The soul of this town?" Her words struck a chord. A few of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, avoiding her gaze. They had been told they were enforcing the law, protecting the innocent. But looking at the line of proud, determined women and the single man standing against them, it was becoming clear who the real villains were. Silas Kane's face was a mask of cold fury. His plan was unraveling. He had lost the element of surprise. He had lost the moral high ground, and he was losing control of the posse. "This isn't over, Boone," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "I will have that deed, and I will see you hang." He turned to the sheriff. "Dobbs, you useless fool, get your men in order." But it was too late. One of the riders at the back of the group, a young farmer Mark recognized, slowly turned his horse. "I ain't part of this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This ain't right." He spurred his horse and rode back down the trail. His act of defiance broke the spell. Another rider followed, then another. Within a minute, half of the posse had deserted, leaving Sheriff Dobbs with only a handful of his most loyal and most paid-for deputies. Dobbs looked from his dwindling posse to the unmovable man on the porch and made a decision. He wasn't going to die on this mountain for Silas Kane's railroad. "This is a tactical retreat," he blustered, trying to salvage some shred of dignity. "We'll be back, Boone, with federal marshals." He and his remaining men turned and followed the others back down the trail, leaving Silas Kane standing alone in the snow, his expensive city coat looking ridiculous in the rugged landscape. Kane glared at Mark, his eyes burning with a hatred that was deep and personal. He spun on his heel and stalked back to his horse, mounting it with a jerky, angry motion. He pointed a gloved finger at the cabin. "Enjoy your sanctuary while it lasts," he spat, "because I'm going to burn it to the ground, with all of you inside." He galloped away, his threat hanging in the cold, clean air. For a long moment after they were gone, no one moved. The silence that descended on the clearing was profound. Then one of the younger women began to sob, the tension of the last hour finally breaking through. Amanda went to her, putting a comforting arm around her shoulders. Mark finally lowered his rifle, his own shoulders slumping slightly. The immediate danger had passed, but the war was far from over. Kane's threat had been real. He was a man who didn't make idle promises. He turned to face the women. He expected to see fear, or worse, accusation in their eyes. He had just been exposed as a violent fugitive, a man with a dark and bloody past. Instead, what he saw was gratitude, and something else. Respect. Amanda stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Your past is your own, Mark Boone," she said softly. "We are all running from something. What matters is the man you are today. And today you stood for us. You did not abandon us, even when it would have been easier to do so." Mark didn't know what to say. For 20 years, his past had been a source of shame, a heavy cloak he wore in his isolation. Now, these women were looking at him, and they were not judging. They were accepting. But the relief was short-lived. A new, chilling thought entered his mind. Kane was smart. He wouldn't just launch a frontal assault again. He would look for another weakness, an angle, a way to get inside their defenses. And as he looked at the 12 women standing on his porch, a terrible possibility began to form. Kane had tried to break him from the outside. What if next time he tried to break them from the inside? Mark's eyes scanned the group from the oldest to the youngest. They were a community bound by faith and shared hardship. They were strong. But were they unbreakable? Was it possible that among these 12 devout, resilient women, there was a weak link, A seed of doubt? Or worse, a traitor? The thought was like a shard of ice in his gut. He had just won the battle, but in doing so, he may have revealed the blueprint for how they could lose the war. The enemy wasn't just at the bottom of the mountain anymore. The real danger might already be inside the house. In the days that followed, an uneasy calm settled over the cabin. It was the quiet of a battlefield between skirmishes. They knew Kane and the sheriff would be back, but they didn't know when or how. The uncertainty was a constant, gnawing presence. Mark threw himself into fortifying their position. He taught the women how to shoot, starting with the smaller hunting rifles he kept. To his surprise, many of them were quick learners, their hands steady, their eyes sharp. Amanda, in particular, showed a natural aptitude, her calm demeanor translating into a patient and deadly aim. A woman must know how to protect her home, whether from a wolf or a man who acts like one, she stated simply, hitting a pine cone from 50 yards away. They set snares and tripwires on the paths leading to the cabin, simple alarms made of twine and old tin cans. They stockpiled wood and water, rationed their food, and stood watches in shifts through the long, cold nights. The cabin became less of a home and more of a fortress, a small island of defiance in a hostile wilderness. But even as their external defenses grew stronger, the seed of doubt Mark felt began to sprout. He started watching, observing the small dynamics within the group. He noticed things he hadn't before. There was a young woman named Rebecca. She was quiet, even for an Amish girl with wide, haunted eyes. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in a whisper. Mark noticed that she would often wander off by herself, always toward the eastern edge of the clearing, where a small game trail led down into a secluded ravine. He had assumed she was just seeking solitude, a moment of peace, but it was happening too often, too regularly. One afternoon, while the other women were busy quilting, a project they had started to both pass the time and create something of value to trade if they ever got the chance. Mark saw Rebecca slip away again. A knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. He decided to follow. He moved through the trees like a ghost, keeping a safe distance. The trail she followed was faint, winding down into the deep shadows of the ravine. It was a place no one would go without a reason. After a 10-minute walk, the ravine opened into a small sheltered clearing, hidden from view of the cabin above. And Rebecca was not alone. A man was waiting for her. He was young, not much older than her, and dressed in the rough clothes of a local ranch hand. Mark recognized him. He was one of the deputies who had been with Sheriff Dobbs. His name was Billy. Mark ducked behind a thicket of firs, his heart pounding with a cold, sickening rhythm. He could hear their voices, hushed and urgent. "Now, can't keep doing this, Billy," Rebecca was saying, her voice trembling. "It's wrong. They've been good to me, to all of us." "It's the only way, Becca," the young deputy replied, his tone pleading. "Kane's promised me a bonus enough to buy that little plot of land down by the river. We can get married, have our own place, just like we always dreamed. All you have to do is find out where they've hidden the deed." A love affair, a promise of a future. It was the oldest trick in the book. Kane hadn't found a traitor. He had made one. "He'll hurt them," Rebecca whispered, tears in her eyes. "He'll hurt Mark." "He won't have to if you just help me," Billy pressed. "Look, Kane's getting impatient. He's talking about burning them out, a fire, an accident. No one gets hurt if you just tell me where it is. We can end this, Becca, tonight." Mark had heard enough. The rage that filled him was white hot, but he controlled it. A blind charge would solve nothing. He needed to think. He slipped back into the woods, his mind a whirlwind of betrayal and tactical calculations. He returned to the cabin, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He said nothing of what he'd seen. He couldn't. Accusing Rebecca without absolute proof would shatter the fragile trust that held their small community together. It would create a panic, a schism he couldn't afford. He had to be sure, and he had to use this betrayal against them. That evening, as they sat down for their meager meal, Mark made an announcement. "Kane's not going to wait for the marshals," he said, his voice low and serious, his eyes scanning the face of every woman in the room. "He's going to get desperate. I think he's planning to attack tonight. We need to be ready, and we need to protect the deed above all else." He looked directly at Amanda. Amanda, where is the satchel? Amanda, looking concerned, pointed to a small, cleverly hidden compartment Mark had built into the floorboards beneath his bed. It is here, the safest place we could think of. Mark nodded slowly, but his eyes flickered toward Rebecca. He saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction, a flicker of her eyes toward the bed, a slight tensing of her shoulders. It was all the confirmation he needed. Good, Mark said, but I don't think it's safe enough. After dark, I'm going to move it. I know a place outside, a small cave hidden behind the waterfall in the North Creek. No one would ever find it there. I'll move it as soon as the sun goes down. It was a lie, a calculated, dangerous lie, but he was setting a trap, and he prayed Rebecca would walk into it. As dusk fell, Mark made a great show of preparing for his task. He put on his heavy coat, took a lantern, and made sure everyone saw him retrieve the leather satchel from the floor compartment. He gave Amanda a reassuring nod, then stepped out into the deepening twilight. But he didn't go to the waterfall. He circled around the cabin in the darkness, extinguishing his lantern once he was out of sight. He crept to the eastern edge of the clearing, near the ravine, and hid himself in the same thicket of firs as before. And he waited. The minutes stretched into an hour. The cold began to seep into his bones. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. He began to wonder if he'd made a mistake. Maybe Rebecca's conscience had won out. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement near the cabin, a dark shape slipping away from the back door, moving quickly and silently toward the ravine. It was Rebecca. She hurried down the path, her feet unsure in the darkness. She reached the hidden clearing and gave a soft whistle. A moment later, the young deputy, Billy, emerged from the shadows. "Did you get it?" Billy asked, his voice filled with a greedy urgency. "No," Rebecca whispered, her voice full of anguish. "He moved it. He took it out of the cabin. He said he was hiding it in a cave behind the North Creek waterfall." Billy cursed under his breath. "The waterfall? Okay, I can find that. I'll tell Kane. This is it, Becca. Tomorrow it'll all be over. We'll have our future." He reached out to touch her, but she flinched away. "Just don't let anyone get hurt, Billy," she pleaded. "Promise me." "Nobody gets hurt," he lied. He turned and disappeared back down the ravine trail. Rebecca stood alone for a moment, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then she turned and began the slow, heavy walk back to the cabin, back to the women she had just betrayed. Mark remained hidden in the shadows, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. The trap was sprung. He now knew for certain about the betrayal, and he knew Kane's plan. They would go to the waterfall, a place far from the cabin, leaving it vulnerable. They would think the deed was there, and that Mark was there protecting it. They would split their forces. It was a classic military blunder, and Mark was going to make them pay for it. He waited until Rebecca was safely back inside the cabin before he moved. He didn't go back to the cabin. He went to the real hiding place for the deed. He went to Amanda. He tapped on the window of the room where she slept, 3 soft knocks like a heartbeat. She opened it, her face pale with worry. "The deed," he whispered, holding out his hand. "Give it to me, now." Without questioning, she retrieved the satchel and passed it through the window. He was the guardian of their last hope. "Get the women ready," he whispered. "Bar the doors and windows. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, do not come out. They're coming tonight. But they're not coming for the cabin first. They're coming for me." He melted back into the night, the leather satchel now secure under his coat. He was no longer just the defender. He was the bait, and he was heading for the waterfall, ready to welcome Silas Kane's men to his mountain. It was time to remind them why men like Marcus Kane were not to be trifled with. The ghost of his past was about to become their living nightmare. Mark moved through the moonlit forest with a deadly purpose. The snow crunched under his boots, the only sound in the vast, cold silence. He wasn't just a mountain man anymore. He was Sergeant Marcus Kane, falling back into the old rhythms of stalking and ambush, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. The North Creek waterfall was a treacherous place in winter, a cascade of ice frozen into a monstrous, glittering sculpture. A small cave hidden behind the curtain of ice was only accessible by a narrow, slippery ledge. It was a perfect choke point, a death trap. He didn't hide inside the cave. That was what they would expect. Instead, he shimmied up the thick trunk of an old pine tree that overlooked the entire scene, its heavy branches providing perfect cover. From his perch, he could see the trail, the frozen creek, and the entrance to the cave. He settled himself, the satchel with the deed tied securely to his back, his rifle resting on a thick bough, and he waited. An hour later, they came. A group of 6 men moving cautiously up the creek bed. Billy, the young deputy, was in the lead, guiding them. They were Kane's hired guns, not the local posse. Hard men with cold eyes, brought in for the dirty work. They stopped at the base of the frozen waterfall, their breath misting in the frigid air. "This is it," Billy said, his voice a nervous whisper. He said it's in the cave behind the ice. One of the hired guns, a big man with a scarred face, spat on the snow. "You wait here, kid. If this is a trick, you're the first one to get a bullet." He motioned to 2 other men. "You 2 with me. The rest of you cover the trail." The 3 men began to pick their way across the icy rocks toward the narrow ledge. They moved slowly, their rifles ready. Mark watched them, his breathing slow and steady. He let them get all the way to the ledge. He let them feel safe. When the scar-faced man was halfway across the ledge, his back to the forest, Mark whistled, a single sharp note that cut through the night. The man froze, spinning around, his rifle coming up. "Who's there?" Mark didn't answer with words. He answered with a bullet. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. He fired at the sheet of ice just above the man's head. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space. A huge chunk of ice, the size of a wagon wheel, shattered and crashed down onto the ledge. The scar-faced man screamed as the ice smashed into him, not cutting him, but sweeping him off the narrow ledge. He fell with a sickening crunch onto the rocks below. The other 2 men scrambled back, terror in their eyes, firing blindly into the trees. Their shots went wild. Mark, hidden in the branches, was invisible. He worked the lever of his rifle, chambering another round. He fired again, not at a man, but at a heavy, snow-laden branch above the 2 men covering the trail. The branch cracked and fell, dumping a massive load of snow on them, burying them for a moment in a white, disorienting cloud. Chaos erupted. The remaining men, including Billy, started firing wildly in all directions. "He's in the trees!" one of them yelled. Mark used their panic to his advantage. He dropped down from the pine tree, landing silently in a deep snowdrift. While they were all looking up, he was now on the ground, a shadow moving between the trees, circling them. He came up behind the last 2 men who were still firing into the branches. He didn't use his rifle. A rifle shot would give away his new position. He used the heavy knife he always carried. He slammed the butt of the handle into the back of one man's head, dropping him without a sound. The other man spun around, but Mark was already there. He disarmed him with a swift, brutal move that snapped the man's wrist, then knocked him unconscious with a single, precise punch to the jaw. Now there was only Billy. The young deputy was standing alone, his pistol shaking in his hand, his eyes darting fearfully into the darkness. "Show yourself!" he cried, his voice high with panic. Mark stepped out from behind a tree, his rifle now leveled at Billy's chest. The young man gasped, his face draining of all color. He looked like a terrified child. "Drop it, Billy," Mark said, his voice calm and cold. Billy's pistol clattered onto the snow. "Don't kill me," he whimpered. "Please, it was for Rebecca. I was going to marry her." "You think she'd marry a man who helps burn women in their beds?" Mark asked, the question sharp as a shard of ice. He took a step closer. Cain lied to you, son. He was never going to let you walk away. You knew too much. After you gave him the deed, he would have put a bullet in your back and left you here for the wolves. The truth of Mark's words hit Billy hard. He sank to his knees, his face crumpling. Mark looked down at the pathetic figure. He could have ended it right there. Part of him, the old Marcus Cain part, wanted to. But then he thought of the women, of Amanda, of the new life they had brought to his mountain. That wasn't who he was anymore. Get up, Mark ordered. You're going to lead me back to your camp, and you're going to do exactly as I say, or that bullet you were so worried about finds you right now. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, the women waited in tense silence. They had heard the distant shots, a terrifying echo through the valley. Every woman except one. Rebecca sat by the cold hearth, consumed by a guilt so profound it was a physical sickness. She had heard Billy's voice in her head, promising her a future, and she had damned them all. She looked at Amanda, who was standing by the barred door, her face a mask of prayerful concentration, and the weight of her betrayal became unbearable. She stood up, her movements stiff. Amanda, she whispered. The other women turned to look at her. I have to confess something. Tears streamed down her face as the whole sordid story poured out of her. The secret meetings, the promises from Billy, the lies she had told him about the waterfall. She had sent Mark into a trap. The women stared at her, a mixture of shock and anger on their faces. But Amanda just listened, her expression unreadable. When Rebecca was finished, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, Amanda did something no one expected. She stepped forward and embraced the weeping girl. Fear makes us do terrible things, child, Amanda said softly, but the Lord's grace is boundless, and now you have a chance to make it right. Just then, a sound came from outside, a low whistle, followed by 3 soft knocks on the door. The signal. Amanda unbarred the door and pulled it open. It was Mark, and he was not alone. He had Billy by the collar, shoving him into the room. 3 of Cain's other men were behind him, their hands bound, their faces bruised and bleeding. The other 2 were left unconscious by the creek. We have guests, Mark said grimly. He tied the prisoners securely to the support beams of the cabin. He turned to Billy. You have one chance to save your life and Rebecca's. Silas Cain is waiting for you down at your camp. You're going to go down there, and you're going to tell him that you have the deed. You're going to tell him Boone is dead, that you killed me yourself. You're going to tell him to come up to the cabin to collect his prize. Alone. Billy stared at him, terrified. He'll kill me. I'll kill you if you don't, Mark said flatly. But if you do this, I'll let you and Rebecca walk away from this mountain and never come back. That's the only deal you're getting. Rebecca stepped forward. I'll go with him, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Cain knows he was using me to get information. He'll believe the lie more if it comes from both of us. It was a desperate, courageous act of atonement. Mark looked at her, then nodded slowly. All right, but know this. If you betray me again, there is no place on God's green earth you can hide. A new plan was in motion, more desperate and dangerous than the last. They weren't waiting for the war to come to them anymore. They were taking it to the enemy. They were going to lure the snake out of his hole. And Mark Boone was waiting, ready to cut off its head. The final confrontation was coming, and it would happen right here, in this small cabin, where it all began. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the cabin like a restless spirit. Inside, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The hired guns were tied securely, their glares promising murder if they ever got free. Mark stood by the main window, peering into the darkness, his rifle in his hand. The women, armed with the remaining rifles and heavy iron skillets, had taken up positions around the room. This was their final stand. An hour passed, then another. The waiting was its own form of torture. Doubt began to creep into Mark's mind. Had Kane seen through the ruse? Had he killed Billy and Rebecca and was now planning a full-scale assault? Then a single light appeared down the trail, a lantern bobbing in the darkness. It was moving slowly, steadily, up toward the cabin. Just one light. "He's coming," Mark breathed. "He's alone." The arrogance of the man was astounding. He truly believed he had won, that the final prize was his for the taking. "Positions," Mark commanded in a low voice. The women melted back into the shadows of the cabin. Amanda stood near the fireplace, one of the hunting rifles held steady in her hands. The room fell silent. The only sound the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. The footsteps grew closer, crunching on the snow-covered porch. Then a sharp knock on the door. "Billy? Rebecca?" Silas Kane's voice called out, smooth and confident. "Open up. Let's not dally. I have a train to catch." Mark gave a slight nod to Amanda. She took a deep breath and then, in a voice filled with convincing, feigned terror, she cried out, "He's dead! The mountain man is dead! Please just take the deed and leave us be." A smug chuckle came from the other side of the door. "Of course, my dear. Just open the door." Mark moved to the side of the door, pressing his back against the rough log wall. He gestured for one of the older women to unbar it. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy wooden beam. The door swung open. Silas Kane stepped inside, his face alight with triumph. He took one step into the room, his eyes immediately falling on the leather satchel sitting on the table, a perfect decoy. "At last," he breathed, reaching for it. "That's far enough, Kane." Mark's voice boomed from the shadows. Kane froze, his hand hovering over the satchel. He spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief as Mark stepped out of the darkness, his rifle leveled directly at Kane's heart. From the other shadows, the armed women emerged, their faces grim and determined. Kane was surrounded. His triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of pure hatred. "Boone! Impossible! The boy said—" "The boy lied," Mark said, taking a step forward. "It's over. Your hired guns are tied to my rafters. The sheriff has no posse left, and you are trespassing on private property." Kane's eyes darted around the room, assessing the situation. He was trapped, but he was not a man who surrendered. His hand, which had been reaching for the satchel, suddenly dropped like a stone toward the small Derringer pistol hidden in his coat pocket. He never made it. Amanda, standing by the fireplace, had been watching his every move. She had seen the subtle shift in his shoulders, the telltale sign of a man about to draw a weapon. She fired the rifle. The shot was deafening inside the cabin, but she hadn't aimed for his chest. She had aimed for his hand. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of his palm, sending the Derringer clattering to the floor. Kane screamed, a high, piercing shriek of pain and fury, clutching his bleeding hand. Before he could recover, Mark was on him, slamming him back against the wall. He ripped the satchel from the table and shoved it into Amanda's hands. "Take the real one and go," he commanded. "Now, get the women and go to the barn. Bar the door." "What about you?" Amanda cried, her face pale. "Kane and I have some unfinished business," Mark growled. He looked at the women. "Go!" Amanda hesitated for only a second, then herded the terrified but resolute women out the back door and toward the safety of the barn. As the last one left, Mark slammed the door shut and barred it. He was now alone in the cabin with a wounded and enraged Silas Kane and three very angry, very tied-up hired guns. Kane, clutching his hand, his face contorted with pain, began to laugh. It was a terrible, unhinged sound. "You think you've won, you ignorant brute? You think you can stop progress? You think this is the end?" He staggered back toward the fireplace, a mad glint in his eye. "This was never just about a deed," he spat, blood dripping from his hand onto the floorboards. "It's about power. It's about taming this savage land. And if I can't have it, no one will." With his good hand, he grabbed the oil lamp from the mantelpiece. "Kane, no!" Mark yelled, lunging for him. But he was too late. Kane hurled the lamp with all his might into the pile of dry quilting scraps the women had left in the corner. The glass shattered, and the oil ignited with a sudden, violent whoosh. Flames erupted, climbing the dry log walls with terrifying speed. The cabin, their sanctuary, was turning into a funeral pyre. The hired guns started screaming, struggling against their ropes as the flames licked closer to them. Smoke filled the room, thick and black. Mark ignored them. He charged through the smoke at Kane, tackling him to the ground. The two men rolled on the floor, trading brutal punches, the heat from the fire scorching their skin. Kane was fighting with the strength of a cornered rat, but Mark's raw power was overwhelming. He landed a solid punch to Kane's jaw, dazing him. He had to get out, but he couldn't just leave the others to burn, no matter who they were. Cursing himself, he grabbed his knife and sawed through the ropes holding the hired guns. "Get out!" he roared, pointing to the back door. The terrified men scrambled out into the night, disappearing into the woods. Now it was just him and Kane. He hauled the half-conscious railroad agent to his feet and dragged him toward the main door. The roof was starting to groan, ready to collapse. He kicked the door open and threw Kane out into the snow. Mark staggered out after him, coughing, his lungs burning. He turned just in time to see the main roof beam give way. The entire cabin collapsed in on itself in a shower of sparks and roaring flames, sending a pillar of fire into the night sky. Everything was gone. His home, his solitude, all of it reduced to ash. He heard the sound of hoofbeats and looked up to see Sheriff Dobbs and a few men riding into the clearing, drawn by the fire. They saw the burning cabin, the wounded Silas Kane trying to crawl away, and Mark Boone standing amidst the chaos like some avenging angel forged in fire and smoke. But something was different. Behind the sheriff, riding at the head of a second group of men, were the ranchers and farmers who had deserted the posse, and with them were Billy and Rebecca, who had not run, but had instead ridden to the surrounding homesteads, telling everyone the truth. One of the ranchers, the one who had left first, rode forward. "We heard what was happening, Boone," he said, his face grim in the firelight. "This ain't the law. This is just greed. We came to help." Sheriff Dobbs looked from the armed ranchers to the defeated Silas Kane, and he finally understood that the tide had turned. The railroad's money was no good to him now. He slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the snow. The fight was over. In the aftermath, as the sun rose on the smoldering ruins of the cabin, a strange new reality took shape. Silas Kane and his remaining men were taken into custody by the ranchers, to be held for the federal marshals who, it turned out, were indeed on their way. Not for Mark, but to investigate the railroad's aggressive and illegal land acquisition tactics. The deed, safe in Amanda's hands, was the key piece of evidence. Mark stood looking at the ruins of his home, the only life he had known for 20 years. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the rifle in his hand. He was homeless. Amanda came to stand beside him. The other women were behind her, their faces smudged with soot, but their eyes clear and full of a new beginning. "You have lost your home because of us," Amanda said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Mark looked at the ruins, then he looked at her, at the community of women standing strong and proud. He looked at the friendly faces of the ranchers who were now offering him flasks of coffee and blankets. "No, ma'am," he said, a slow, small smile touching his lips for the first time. "I didn't lose a home. I think I just found one." They built a new community in that valley, on the 500 acres that was rightfully theirs. They built new homes, a church, a school. The ranchers from the surrounding area helped, bringing lumber and supplies, forging a new friendship born of fire and justice. And Mark Boone, the mountain man, the ghost, the hermit, built his new cabin right in the center of it all. He was no longer a man in isolation. He was a protector, a friend, a founder. The women with their strength and faith had not just saved their land. They had saved him. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held him prisoner. Sometimes on quiet nights, he would look up at the high country where his old life had been, and he would remember the silence. But he would not miss it, because now his life was filled with the sounds of hymns, of laughter, and of a community that had faced the fire and emerged stronger than ever before. What do you think? Was Mark a hero, or just a man pushed too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you, and it really helps the channel. And if you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption in the Old West, Do us a favor and smash that like button, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next story. Thanks for watching.